Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fire first, the Great Hinckley Fire. Then I'll talk a little bit about my research methods. And then I'll have probably about 35 minutes of going into the book. So I'm going to jump right in. If I'm talking too soft, just raise your hand and I'll try to get louder, okay? So my book, like Julie mentioned, is The Day the World Burned. And it's historical fiction, meaning the main characters in the plot I made up from my imagination, but the history, the setting, and the time, they were all researched, in case you weren't familiar with it. 1894 was just over 130 years ago. Cars were not invented yet, so people got around by horse, train, or boat. Indoor plumbing and electricity had been invented, but it wasn't widespread yet. Mostly wealthy families in larger cities were able to get it. Grover Cleveland was the president of the United States, and Minnesota had only been a state for 36 years. Hinckley was the most populated town in Pine County. It had 2 railroad depots, a 2-story schoolhouse, many thriving businesses, restaurants, saloons, churches, hotels, a baseball diamond where the Hinckley Crescents played, and there was also a team of volunteer firefighters. And all of these photos on the screen are from the Hinckley Fire Museum. Hinckley's largest employer was the Brennan Lumber Company. In 1874, an Irish immigrant, Thomas Brennan, built a sawmill in Hinckley and hired teams of men called shanty boys to log the pine forests outside of Hinckley. Logging season starts in the fall when the shanty boys met up at the logging camp. They'd cut down the trees, trim off the branches, and leave those branches in piles or just where they lay. Then they dragged the logs to the Grindstone River and stacked them on ice. In the spring, when the ice thawed, the logs would float and men would drive them downriver to the mill pond, which is right next to the sawmill in Hinckley. There, the logs would be fed through the sawmill and cut into lumber. The lumber was stacked in the lumberyard to dry all summer since kilns were not widely used yet. The summer of 1894 was very hot and extremely dry. A weather station in St. Paul only reported 2 inches of rainfall all summer. The grass was dry and brittle, and it was very common for small fires to start in the woods. Most of the land in Pine County was still forest, and the land that had already been logged had those piles of branches left by the logging companies. This ended up being a perfect fuel for the fire. On Saturday, September 1st, 1894, 2 fires started around the same time at midday. One started in a farmer's field in Quamba, where he was cutting and stacking hay. The second started near the train tracks in Mission Creek. Both of these fires moved towards Hinckley at the same time, and they merged just south of the town and turned into what we now call the Great Hinckley Fire. The impact of this fire was significant. We lost 6 towns: Brook Park, Mission Creek, Hinckley, Finlayson, Sandstone, and Ascove. In total, the fire destroyed over 200,000 acres, which is twice the size of the city of Chicago. The recorded death count was 418, but many historians believe that number to be much higher. And just for a quick comparison, I put up the fires that were going on in January in California. We think that was between like 20 and 40,000 acres. So the Hinckley fire was very extensive. Fortunately, there were many survivors. They were able to tell their stories and describe how they survived in wells, ponds, or in the Grindstone River. Some boarded trains that evacuated them moments before the fire engulfed Hinckley. On the eastern Minnesota tracks, a passenger train and a freight train joined together and reversed all the way to Superior, Wisconsin, saving about 475 lives. On the St. Paul and Duluth tracks, the limited number 4 passenger train, also called the Scally, stopped north of Hinckley and boarded men, women, and children who were running from the fire. This train backed up to Skunk Lake and saved 300 lives. If anyone was left in Hinckley when the fire did come through, their best chance of survival was in a 3-acre hole in the ground called the gravel pit. And we think 100 people survived the fire that way. So over 4 years ago, I had an idea for a book, and I wanted it to be historical fiction because I like to read historical fiction and I like to do research. I grew up in Pine City, and I had heard of the Great Hinckley Fire, so I thought it'd be a perfect setting for my story. And I started here at the library, actually, and tried to read every single book that they had on the fire. So this slide shows all the books I read. It was a mix of primary and secondary sources. A primary source is an original first-hand account. So diaries, letters, journals, speeches, interviews, photographs, and artifacts are all primary sources. 2 of these you can buy yourself at the Hinckley Fire Museum. They'll call this the Red Book and the Yellow Book. That's really what they call it. The Red Book is a collection of first-hand accounts from survivors. And I can't remember the publication date, but it is decades after the fire, so sometimes as memories can fade, some of the details are off, but there's really good details in here, like people remembered what they were wearing, who was with them, stuff like that, which I ended up using. This one was published in 1895, I think, in Swedish, and then I want to say in the 70s it was translated to English. And there's a lot of good stories in here too. I think it was written by a man that lived in Pine County, and I don't remember his name, and I don't know how to speak Swedish, so I don't know, it's that word. A secondary source, which I have quite a list on here, is a work that interprets, analyzes, or summarizes primary sources. These books are created by individuals or groups who are not directly involved in the historical event. So nonfiction textbooks and biographies are some examples. And I'm pretty sure every single one of these books is either available here or within the circulation of the East Central Library System. And I think only one of them I had to get through interlibrary loan from the University of Minnesota system. And I brought 2 examples of those. So these are really good ones about the fire, Dan Brown, Under a Flaming Sky. And this one's a little older. I think it was published in the 80s by a professor, Lawrence H. Larson, Wall of Flames. This one is narrative nonfiction, so it does kind of read like a story. This one is much more like a textbook, but it was essential for me when I put together the timelines for the trains. I also did in-person research. Like I said, I started here at the library. I also used the microfilm machine to read old newspapers. The newspaper in Hinckley in 1894 was called the Hinckley Enterprise. I was able to read the last edition before the fire on August 29th and the first edition written after the fire on December 19th. I also went to the Hinckley Fire Museum to view photographs, look at artifacts, and read the death list, which I'll explain what that is in a slide coming up. Lastly, I traveled to St. Paul to visit the Gale Family Library. This library is part of the Minnesota Historical Society located at the Minnesota History Center on Kellogg Boulevard. The library houses a vast collection of books, maps, manuscripts, photographs, newspapers, and government records. And this library is unique in that you can't check anything out. Anything in the library has to stay in that room. You can bring cameras, laptops. I don't think pens are allowed, just pencils. And they have lockers outside the library that you're supposed to put your things in, and they don't want any big coats or backpacks. But the staff is very helpful. I even had a problem citing one of my sources, and just through email they were really helpful with that. Okay, so that was a little bit on the fire and my research for the book. The rest of my presentation breaks down the book into 4 parts. The prologue, part 1, 2, and 3. And I'm gonna do my best to go through each one and tell you what was inspired by true events and then what I completely made up. And I'm assuming at least some of you have started the book or read the book. So if you haven't read it, this is your fair warning. There might be spoilers ahead. Not anything big, but I do want to go through some events in the book I figured out how to put into the book through research. So fair warning. So starting with the prologue, these were real people. Engineer Jim Root, fireman Jack McGowan, and conductor Thomas Sullivan, Benjamin Bartlett, and the two men who jumped onto the cowcatcher. I made up the backstory for those two men, but I really did read about them. The opening scene of the book follows engineer Jim Root as he drives the Scally towards Hinckley. He and his fireman, Jack McGowan, were in the cab of the locomotive, engine number 69, which is on the slide. When Root saw people running towards the train, he jumped out and ran to them. One of the men fleeing Hinckley was Benjamin Bartlett. He had owned the Eating House restaurant in Hinckley for 15 years. He and his family decided to leave their house 5 or 10 minutes before 4 o'clock. Along with 6 employees, they ran to the St. Paul and Duluth train tracks, which run north and south in Hinckley. But only 3 of the employees made it with Bartlett and his family to Root's train. Engineer Jim Root, this is a photo of him. He was born in Greenbush, New York in 1843 and started working for railroads when he was 14. During the Civil War, he operated the train that served as headquarters for General T. Sherman during his march to the sea. After his military service ended, he moved to Minnesota, married, and worked at a sawmill and lumberyard. In 1870, he joined the newly formed St. Paul and Duluth Railway Service as an engineer dispatcher. The following year, he became an engineer, and in 1894, he was a senior engineer with over 20 years of experience. After the fire, Root was a celebrity, and his story was on the front page of every major newspaper in America. He continued his railroad career until 1908 when he retired to New York with his wife. 3 years later, he passed away at the age of 67. In 1895, Jim Root and Thomas Sullivan wrote letters to Reverend William Wilkinson, who was writing a book about the fire, and they both described their experiences. Both men mentioned the explosion that slammed in the train just after it started to back up, so this is something that happens in the prologue. After the explosion, Root saw 3 men outside running towards the train, and in his book, William Wilkinson quotes Root as saying, "I heard a hollering and saw 3 men fleeing. 2 of those men got onto the cowcatcher. 1 man caught onto the cowcatcher for a short distance and fell off and was burned. The other man rode to Skunk Lake on the cowcatcher, and there he got off." So besides Root's letter to Wilkinson, I couldn't find another source describing the 2 men who jumped onto the cowcatcher. Their true story is lost to history, but when I read about them, I knew I had to include them in my book somehow, especially the man who made it to Skunk Lake. As I kept researching and drafting my outline, I also realized that Anna and her sister Mary could not experience all the incredible and horrific events that happened on this day, so I needed another character that was in Hinckley when the fire swept through. And I remembered this story of the man on the cowcatcher, and that's how I created Carl.
Oh.
So, I don't usually mention that at book events, so that's a historical nugget for you. Okay, part 1. Oh. So these are the characters that were real people. Belle Barden and her family, Clara and her brother Charlie, who are friends of Anna's. Angus Hay was real, he has a slide coming up. And then almost all of the locations in part 1 of the book were real places in Hinckley, including the lumber mill, the baseball diamond, the depots, a place called the Beanery, that was like a cafe restaurant at the train station, Cronenberg Saloon, Axel Hansen's Opera House, a cigar shop, and Belle Barden's house was a real place, although I couldn't find its exact location, so I'm guessing on that. And then these are all the characters that I made up. There was one place in part 1 I made up, the sod house. I just needed a place for Anna and Carl to meet in secret, so I made up a sod house, and then I found this cool picture online, so I just decided to use it. I imagine it was something like that. The new women. The term new women, mentioned in chapter 1, represented a generation of women who came of age between 1890 and 1920. These women challenged gender norms and structures by asserting a new public presence through work, education, entertainment, and politics, while also denoting a distinctly modern appearance that contrasted with Victorian ideals of the previous generation. For example, during this time period, women's fashion took a radical turn from the bulky layers, fussy details, and large bustles, which were deliberately impractical. The Victorian lady was a woman of leisure and taste who never engaged in useful or productive activity. And on the other hand, these new women, they emphasized mobility, freedom, and modernity. A new woman wanted clothes that were less restrictive and ornamental in order to accommodate her more physical and active lifestyle. She wore a shirtwaist with leg of mutton sleeves and a bell-shaped skirt with no frills. Corsets, however, continued to be used to either achieve or accentuate a tiny waist. And I kind of mentioned like what Anna and her sister were wearing in the book, so that's why I included this. At the same time as fashion trends were allowing more freedom of movement for women, the modern bicycle became more affordable and common. First invented in the 1880s, the safety bicycle, as it was called, had two equal-sized wheels and a frame that was made of hollow steel tubing. The old design, known as the ordinary bicycle, was very expensive. It cost between $100 and $150 on average, which ended up being about 6 months' pay. And they were also very unstable because of their wooden frame and solid rubber tires. So this is the bicycle that had the really big wheel in front and the little one in the back. The price of safety bicycles, on the other hand, which were much more popular in the 1890s, the price dropped during this time, and basic models could sell as low as $30, which was around half a month's pay. And the Gibson girl, also mentioned, I think in chapter 1 too, she was the personification of the feminine ideal of attractiveness and modernity. She had an exaggerated S-curved torso and hair piled on top of her head in a bouffant or pompadour fashion. But she was created by a man. His name was Charles Dana Gibson, and he was an American illustrator who published his sketches in popular magazines and national publications, such as Collier's Weekly, Life magazine, Ladies' Home Journal, and Scribner's. And this is what I imagine Mary looked like, the older sister. So Angus Hay, which I mentioned a little bit before, and the newspaper, the Hinckley Enterprise. So established in 1891 by D.C. Shepherd, the Pine Dart or Pinewood Dart was a weekly newspaper reporting local, national, and international news to the citizens of Hinckley. Angus Hay, a young bachelor and active community member, bought the paper from Shepherd in 1892 and changed the name to the Hinckley Enterprise. Hay spiced up the weekly articles with human interest stories, gossip, and political opinion articles. The Hinckley Enterprise continued circulation until 1921. And this clipping right here, that's the front page of the last edition of the paper before the fire. And I read this here on the microfilm machine. Anna reads it to her mother in chapter 7 on page 88. The inviting scene at Cronenberg Saloon in chapter 8 was very intentional. I read Kelly Dixon's Boomtown Saloons, which describes and analyzes the excavation of 4 19th century saloon sites in Nevada, which was a mining boomtown. Instead of the violent and seedy establishments which populate the Old West narrative, Dixon found that these sites were much more than that. Serving a more socially diverse clientele, these saloons served as an important role for entertainment, socialization, relaxation, and just a diversion from the hardships of life on the frontier. I believe that many of the saloons in Hinckley in the 1890s, which was a logging boomtown, served a similar purpose. And I couldn't find a photo of Cronenberg's before the fire, so Judy sent me one of a saloon here in Pine City. This photo was taken between 1900 and 1915, so the time's a little off, but kind of the similar feel. Belle Barden, who's Anna's best friend in the book, she really did host a dancing party on the night before the fire. And she and her friends danced, they played kissing games, and they ate cold chicken and raisin pie before saying goodnight. For some, like Anna's friend Charlie, it was a final goodbye. Belle wrote about her experience in the Red Book on pages 45 through 47. She wrote, "We were a happy bunch of school chums looking forward to the opening of school on September 3rd. Our ages ranged from 15 to about 17 years, and at that time, no one could have had more fun than we did. We used to have our regular house parties, meeting at the various homes. There were about 8 in our crowd, just enough for 2 sets of square dance. And I shall always remember the fun we enjoyed at these parties, dancing and playing all kinds of games, the most exciting of which was a game called Post Office, which shows up in the book. So I had to include that. I just thought it was so sweet. Belle, her mother, and her brothers and sisters all survived the fire on the Bestberry combination train. This is the one that reversed all the way to Superior, Wisconsin. Her father, Jake, stayed in Hinckley and survived. He was reunited with them days after the fire and moved them to Little Falls. Belle stayed in Little Falls for the remainder of her life. She married John Harold Raymond in June of 1901 at her parents' home on a Tuesday at 9 o'clock in the morning. It was a quiet ceremony with only the families of the young couple present. Belle wore a white organdy dress trimmed with embroidery and stitched pleats, and she carried cream roses. Their marriage announcement, I was able to find that online. It was posted in the Little Falls Herald on Friday, June 28th, and it described Belle as follows. Mrs. Raymond has a large number of friends who hold her in high esteem on account of her true worth and quiet dignity. So I thought that was very sweet, and being Anna's best friend, I just wanted to include it today. So that's what happens to Belle. Now we're on to part 2, the really exciting part. These characters were real. John Blair, the second one, these men were at Pekegama. They were real people. Mrs. Carver, Alice and Mabel were real. The fire chief, John Craig, the Beatties and the Wards also lived in Pekegama. Lucy and Caleb Kelsey and their family, and then Dr. Chauncey, his wife, and their sons were all real people that show up in my book. I don't think I made up many people in part 2. Mr. Ganya, who was a real person who lived in Pekegama, he shows up in part 2. He really did suffer from burns all over his body, which you can read about. And he did lay next to the mill pond in Pekegama all night by himself without food, water, or medicine. In chapter 21, I write that Mary gave him some of her laudanum to help him with his pain. That didn't happen. And I just wanted to mention that he did survive, and he did that all by himself. So that part I did make up. Let's see. Okay, Brook Park, which is Pekegama. In the 1870s, a lumber camp, one of many, was set up in the woods of Pine County along Pekegama Creek. In the late 1880s, the Eastern Minnesota Railroad finished laying track near this lumber camp, and pioneers started coming. The only official entrance and exit to this small settlement was a platform 8 miles southwest of Hinckley called Pekegama Station. In the spring of 1894, a post office was established and named Brook Park. As was common in these days, if the post office was named differently than the settlement, the post office name stuck. The township of Brook Park was incorporated on April 18th, 1894. The sawmill also opened in this spring and employed a small crew. A general store and boarding house were considered the city center and hub of social activity. I couldn't have included the town of Pekegama without Lucy Kelsey's book called The September Holocaust. She published it in 1895, and she was a fire survivor. It's the only contemporary resource of the fire that I found written by a woman, and the only resource that described the settlement of Pekegama before the fire. And she refers to the town mostly as Pekegama, so that's why I decided to use that name in the book. I saw it referenced as both names, but more commonly as Pekegama during the years of the fire. 4 town promoters, represented by their firm, the Kelsey Markham Land Company, owned 15,000 acres of forest in this area. 3 of the promoters were brothers: Caleb, who was Lucy's husband, his brother Byron, and his other brother, Dr. Chauncey. And Dr. Chauncey, Caleb, and Lucy all show up in part 2. The 4th partner was J.D. Markham of Rush City, which I found a photo of him. These men, along with other Pekegama Brook Park families, hoped to build a city and create a community prosperous enough to rival the neighboring city of Hinckley. And it didn't happen. Lucy. A school dedication ceremony was planned for the afternoon of September 1st, 1894, as children would start classes after the Labor Day holiday. Every family in the town planned to attend, including Lucy and her family. At lunchtime, Lucy noted in her book that it grew oppressively warm and the wind became noticeably stronger. It tore through her house, blowing draperies and shades in a frantic manner and threatening to rip off the window boxes full of flowers. When sparks, ashes, and cinders started falling from the sky, Lucy realized what was happening. At first, she went down the footpath to her house, which she referred to as the Evergreen Path, and that's how I write about it, call it in my book. She was looking for a way to escape, but the forest was filled with smoke. She also noted a squirrel running back and forth, uncertain which way to go. That's when she came back to her house and ordered her family to the well. While her husband grabbed the ladder from the house because he had not yet built the stairway to the second floor, Lucy put her most important items into a basket. And this is what she put in: her gold watch, her pocketbook, her brand new eyeglasses that she just had fitted a couple weeks before, some valuable paperwork, and a few clean pocket handkerchiefs. Lucy, her husband Caleb, and their 4 children stood on the ladder in their well for hours. They dipped blankets in water and draped them over their bodies to stop dropping embers and sparks from catching fire. Lucy and Caleb splashed water onto their heads and their children's heads to remain cool in the intense heat. The children were frightened and crying, but the roar of the fire drowned out any noise. Eventually, after the noise died down, it became easier to breathe, but the children still cried. Lucy tried to quiet them and reassure them, so she started singing, and together they sang a hymn to pass the time and bring them comfort. And I use this same hymn in the book when Anna starts singing it to her sister Mary. It was just kind of a nod to Lucy. Anna and Mary survived the fire in the same manner that Lucy and her family survived, in a well. The chapters where the sisters climb out of the well, their journey through the devastation, passing the ruins of the doctor's house, their time at the Pekegama Pond, and their night in the boxcar of Lath, that's all inspired by Lucy's experience. Lucy's account is not shared across all textbooks, like she's not mentioned in this one at all. So it was important for me to reflect her experience through Anna and Mary. Lucy, her family, and Dr. Chauncey's family all stayed in Pekegama. They decided not to leave even in the hours and days after the fire. They started to rebuild immediately, and Caleb is buried in the Brook Park Cemetery. After his death in 1909, his wife Lucy moved to California and remarried. And that's all I could find about Lucy after the fire. Hinckley. Afternoon on September 1st, John Craig, chief of the Hinckley Fire Department, rang a gong at City Hall, summoning the 19 volunteer firefighters to a meeting. It was clear from the horrible-looking black cloud looming to the south that a fire was near. The meeting was not declared in panic, but in precaution. The men who came included veteran volunteers and many of the town's prominent citizens, including the mayor, Lee Webster, and the Catholic priest, Father Lawler. Everyone in the room was confident in their ability and equipment, but it was still important to have a plan, so there was no panic at this point. They decided that if a fire was coming, it would most likely come from the south, so they hitched up their brand new fire engine, made by the Waterous Engine Works in St. Paul. They hooked it up to a horse cart, including 2,000 feet of fire hose, and they headed to the southwest corner of town. While they were setting up, the last 2 scheduled trains passed safely through Hinckley, so this was about 2 o'clock. Both were passenger trains. One was heading north to Duluth, and one was heading south to the cities. Some family members put their loved ones on these trains in precaution. Many of them were women and children carrying their most prized possessions. And at 2:15, John Craig ordered the sawmill to sound their whistle in general alarm. Carl and Anna's father, Paul, hear this whistle in chapter 14. But still, most of the people in Hinckley did not flee. When falling firebrands and embers fell on structures on the southwest corner of town, the volunteer firefighters were ready. The mill workers came to help hold the fire line, and they fought the flames for over an hour. When a building on the east side of town caught fire, John Craig mounted his horse and rode to check it out. On his way, he stopped at the telegraph office to send a telegram to Rush City for more hose. When he returned to the southwest corner of town, probably between 3:20 and 3:30 in the afternoon, Most of the firefighters had already ran, and the hose was on fire. Craig rode through town warning the citizens to escape, realizing that the town was going to burn. John's story is very interesting, so I wanted to give him his own slide. He shows up in chapter 2 in Carl's scenes. John Wesley Blair was born on this day, April 27th, in 1853 in Little Rock, Arkansas, to parents Norval and Mary Blair. Because Arkansas was still a slave state in 1853, it is possible that Blair was born into slavery. The ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865 officially ended slavery in Arkansas. Blair would have been 12 years old. He lived in Illinois for some years, where he met and married Emma Bell in 1881, and they had 2 children in 1887 before he moved his family to St. Paul, and he stayed there until his death in 1922. For Blair, the day of the fire started like any other workday. He was a porter for the St. Paul and Duluth Railway. So he helped 125 passengers board the Scally at the Duluth Union Depot and looked forward to having supper with his family after they arrived in St. Paul later in the evening. But just after 4 o'clock, the train stopped about a mile-ish north of Hinckley, and Blair, along with the passengers, looked out the windows to see why they had stopped. Crowds of people were ascending onto the train looking to be rescued. Blair helped the new passengers, guiding them to any available seat or spot on the floor. At the same time, he was also trying to calm the growing panic of the Duluth passengers. The train began to slowly reverse, making its way towards Skunk Lake, when suddenly something slammed into the side of the passenger coaches, rocking them side to side and blowing out every window. Flames crawled up the sides of the train and started to creep in through the broken windows. It pushed already panicked passengers over the edge. Many stood up, screaming and pushing their way to exits. Some fainted, some crawled under the seats, and one man jumped through a broken window, disappearing into the flames. A few people took initiative and tried to stop the madness, including conductor Thomas Sullivan, porter John Blair, and a passenger named Robert Bell. Bell and Blair wetted towels in the washroom and passed them to passengers, instructing them to cover their faces. As the train picked up speed, the rush of air fanned the flames, turning the passenger carriage into an inferno. Flames licked the ceiling and the temperature inside intensified. Curtains and seat cushions ignited. Blair found a chemical fire extinguisher, which I didn't know existed at the time, and walked up and down the aisle, ordering people to lie down as he sprayed them. When the train finally did reach Skunk Lake, Blair jumped outside and sprayed each passenger as they jumped off. When the fire extinguisher ran dry, Blair threw it to the ground and ran down the train embankment to a barbed wire fence and started yelling to the confused passengers to run towards him, towards the safety of Skunk Lake. The actions of Blair and the other men on the train, who helped calm the chaos of the panicked passengers, was nothing short of heroic. Besides Blair's actions of putting the lives of others before his own, all the first-hand accounts that I read about him corroborated his actions and also noted his, quote, courageous and cool-headed demeanor during the entire ordeal, end quote. His bravery and his decision to remain calm stood out on that awful day, and everyone who witnessed it remembered him. The Gale Family Library at the Minnesota Historical Society has an archival collection of the personal account of Blair's efforts, and they call it the John Blair Papers. It includes family records, newspapers, articles, and handwritten letters from passengers on the train, confirming and praising his behavior. I use these primary sources, especially the letters written by other train passengers, to piece together his character, his description, his behavior, and it helped with the dialogue when he was talking with Carl in the chapters of part 2. And now we're on to part 3. So if you've made it that far in the book, all of these characters were real people, and I'm not going to go into detail on anyone in case you haven't got to that point yet. And I just quickly wanted to note the Pine County coroner at the time was Dr. Cowan, and he created the death list, which was the list trying to identify all the bodies that they found. I mentioned this list in chapter 29, and you can read through it yourself at the Hinckley Fire Museum. They also have the registered survivors too. Oh, and I think I mentioned that the death count was 418. And that was in 1894 when they made it. So as bodies showed up over the years, they kept adding to that. Part 3 does have some fictional characters. Mrs. Howard, I totally made her up, but the location of her house in Pine City was a real house. It was called the Brandy's house. It would have been just across the street in the parking lot of Franson Bank. Also the hospital rank, if you got that far in the book, I only mentioned the presence of one doctor, Dr. Barnum. He was Pine City's doctor at the time, but in fact there were many more doctors than that. His daughter Kate was a real person, and I mentioned her in part 3. She was in Hinckley during the fire, and she returned to Pine City on a train 4 days after the fire. And I just have to note, get it off my chest, in the book I wrote that her dad went to go get her, which is not historically accurate. So she came on a train by herself back home. Oh, I feel so much better. Pine City. Pine City was untouched by the fire. On Saturday, by late evening, a few fire survivors had already arrived in Pine City and shared what had happened in Hinckley. Immediately, mill whistles and church bells were sounded, and a torchlight meeting was held in Robinson Park, just across the street, to organize immediate relief efforts. The indoor skating rink was converted into a makeshift hospital. Children ran from house to house, knocking on doors, waking up families, and asking for food, clothing, and blankets. The town's doctors gathered medicine, bandages, and liquor. One of those doctors was Dr. Elbert Eugene Barnum, and many history books on the fire mention Dr. Barnum and his role at the skating rink, but Judy Shalene's book, The Doctor Is In, is by far the most informative and descriptive. So if you're interested in learning more about him and any of the other country doctors in Pine City, I highly recommend that you get this book. And I was just mentioning to Judy, I'm working on a second book, which I use this for research. Families in Northeast Minnesota, especially Pine City, Duluth, Superior, and Mora, were the first to aid survivors of the fire. If they were not searching for bodies, they were collecting food, clothing, money, and medical supplies. By Monday, Governor Knute Nelson had appointed a state fire relief commission to oversee and coordinate relief efforts. Charles Pillsbury headed the commission, and a man named H.H. Hart was the secretary. Hart traveled to Pine City to set up relief headquarters and take over coordinating efforts from locals. He distributed meal tickets, transportation passes, and approved requests for clothing and supplies. He stayed in Pine City for a month before moving the relief headquarters to Hinckley. In the days immediately following the fire, the relief effort was coordinated locally by community leaders in Pine City, Mora, Duluth, and Superior. These people did not question the needs of survivors and generously gave blankets, food, and clothing to whomever asked for it. After local agents were appointed by the commission, these state representatives questioned survivors to verify their needs before giving out permanent aid in the form of cash, lumber, seeds, clothing, and tools. 8 rules were passed down by the commission to guide these local agents in their decision making. And the first 2 rules I put up on the slide because they guided Carl's experience with his interviewer in chapter 34 of the book. So the first rule, local agents would be appointed and given exclusive power to make decisions on individual cases. And the second rule, no one was to be better off after the fire than before as a result of state relief. Which, again, if you read chapter 34, that's the dialogue that I use in his interview. The commission appointed Pine County Attorney Robert Saunders of Hinckley, a fire survivor, to investigate all land titles impacted by the fire. Saunders worked with homeowners to secure a clear title to a piece of land for a house to be built, or to persuade land companies to extend contracts in terms of payment due to extraordinary circumstances. If that was not a possibility, he helped the homeowner find a free or cheap piece of land to build a house. After land terms were settled, local agents dispersed building materials for fire relief houses, which were 16 by 24 feet simple frame dwellings, and I have a picture on the slide of that. These houses costed between $95 and $150. Getting married. So if you've gotten to part 3, this part will make sense. As for the comment the lawyer, Mr. Saunders, makes to Carl about getting married in order to obtain building materials from the commission, 2 secondary sources mention this. Neither source gives an explanation nor lists an original source. The first one simply stated, "A few young men were given larger amounts of lumber than otherwise by promising to marry their girlfriends." That was in this book, actually. Lawrence Larson's book, and he didn't have a source for it. And the other book was Grace Swenson's From the Ashes, which I know is in this library. She said that generally no homes were built for single men unless they had owned a home before the fire, but the commission waived this restriction if a young man had since married and intended to settle down. So I doubt that this policy was passed down by the commission, and I didn't find it anywhere. Because local agents had exclusive power to make decisions on each case, I imagine that this marriage exception could have happened maybe once or twice, but I don't think it was a widespread policy. It just fit in my storyline perfectly, so I had to jump on that. The registration cards. Interviews like the one Carl experienced in chapter 34 really did happen, although I doubt they ever happened in a tent. I made that part up. The questions that the interviewer asks Carl are straight from these registration cards, and I read these at the Gale Family Library. You can't really tell from the photo, but these papers are disintegrating. You can almost see through them, they're so old. Handwritten notes on the back of each registration card listed in detail every item the person received from the commission. A few more scandalous ones that I read fed into the storyline that the interviews were judgments of moral character and not needs-based. These handwritten notes and letters are stapled or paper clipped to their official registration card. And as I mentioned, the paper is deteriorating over time. And for me, the cursive was very hard to read, but I haven't written or read cursive since 3rd grade. Thankfully, my mom was with me, so she was able to read it. And again, these ones aren't a good example, but some of the cursive was just beautiful, and for me, it was just very hard to read. I put an example. Again, you can't take any of these items out of the library, but you can take photos of them. So this is Adolf Shepstedt. He was 36 on the day of the fire, and his wife Martha was also 36. They have 2 children, ages 8 and 5. He listed his occupation as blacksmith, and he wrote that he has furniture left after the fire. He only needs a coat, vest, and transportation to Rush City, which on the back of his card says he was given these on September 4th. There were 2 handwritten letters attached to his registration card, and I put those photos up here. One noted that he traded the coat and vest for cash and is blowing it because, quote, "He has always been a drunken deadbeat. We have already donated to his starving family." And these are letters written to those local agents who are in each of these cities. The second letter from Murdoch Burdash, which is, I think, some type of liquor store, he confirms that this man came to him with a sack of clothes and sold them all for drinks. I read through dozens, my mom and I read through dozens of these registration cards, and most of them were not like this. This was a unique example. So of course I took pictures of it and used it in the book. I think that many survivors did receive aid from the committee that helped them start their lives again, and a lot of them, I shouldn't say were boring, but were just like that. So a lot of them got seeds and clothing, some got furniture, things to help them start their life again. I think, after reading about this for so long, that the survivors with family, church, or community members that helped them were the ones that were really able to succeed. So why was it important for me to be historically accurate in my book? Because after reading the accounts of survivors, I wanted to honor their sacrifice and ensure that their stories were not forgotten. Many of the stories I read were sources of inspiration because they were examples of bravery and resilience, and I wanted that to be reflected in Anna and Carl's story. And that's all I have today. questions about the fire, about reading the books or the characters, anything?
Where'd the character of John come from?
Oh, John. So in 2020 is when I came up with an idea for a book, and it was actually just Anna and Mary originally. And I wanted the John scene to happen in like minutes before a natural disaster, because I guess that's just how my mind works. I thought it'd be an interesting book to read about. So that's where John came from, but he's not really based off a person. He's not historically accurate either. So he's just part of the drama of the book.
Oh, it was wonderful.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
Is the second book going to be a carry-on from this book, or is it all different?
It will be a carry-on from this book. It'll follow Carl and Anna.
Oh, okay.
Kind of like where are they now? Maybe like 10, 11 years after the fire.
Okay.
Yep.
What Shuey family are you from?
I am a Marian. I married Daniel Shuey.
And he is?
He is the son of David,
Okay,
grandson of Robert.
yes.
Mhm. I think he's the cutest one, Daniel. That's why I married him. But Daniel actually helped a lot with the book. In 2020, when I came up with the idea, I told him about it, and he immediately said, "You should write a book about it." And then I sat on the idea for a long time, but he kept bugging me about that I should actually write it.
Yeah, Bob was quite active with this
Yes,
organization.
yes, he was. Yep.
I just wanna say, I loved your, like, after the fire, like, it's so easy to think, oh, there was a big fire and it destroyed everything,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
hearing those actual personal stories of what they went through, like, their clothes were burned off and, you know, their hair was gone, and, I mean,
Mhm.
just all of those things, it was just so remarkable to hear, and I never thought about that, like, what did happen to those people that survived?
Yeah.
Where did they go? How did they make it work through
Mhm.
losing absolutely everything in
Mhm.
this time frame? It was really, really fascinating to read that, so I loved all of that.
And I have to say that you wrote it well, and you made it seem so real, that
Thanks.
I'm thinking all the time, you know, this is really something, these poor people, you know, you
Mhm.
really feel the, idea that these were real people
Yeah.
and felt for them what they went through.
Yep.
So
I
you
felt
did a
like
good
that
job.
reading, thank you. I felt that just reading their stories in other books, especially if it was from them. So thank you, I tried to do that.
You did a good job.
Thanks.
One of my favorite parts, well, I don't know if I can even narrow one down, but when they were in the well, hiding in the well, I just felt like I was
Oh,
there.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
I was wet, I was cold, I
Yep.
was burning,
I'd be
I was
shivering,
just
yeah.
thinking,
Yeah.
get out of here.
And I wish I had Lucy's book, but
And
that
I
was,
had that quilt. the quilt.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep. She wrote about that, and even the people along the mill pond or like at Skunk Lake, they got so cold at night because they didn't have anything, and it was September. It wasn't super warm at night. In part 2, when Anna has symptoms of hypothermia, I think it was referred to in Lucy's book as an old trouble, so that's what I called it. It was Dr. Chauncey's wife who actually had that happen to her in a boxcar. So I used it for Anna. I thought that was interesting. And Carl, I think they talked about that on the banks of Skunk Lake afterwards, just being so cold. So it's kind of interesting. You go from intense heat and literally being burned up and then cold. Another symptom I read a lot about that I didn't think of beforehand was eye damage, because the smoke was so thick on that day. That was actually the biggest complaint, like at the Rink Hospital, and even the hospitals in Duluth, was eye pain because of the smoke damage.
Was the part with the gypsies rolling through town, that was researched, I assume? Or
Yes.
probably happened at one time?
That did happen. I think it happened earlier in the summer, like in July, but I just thought it was so interesting, I wanted to use it. And they really did have a bear that I think was dancing. Dan Brown mentions it in his book. and I think he has the original source, which I just can't think of right now, but yeah, I thought that'd be fun to include that they actually did, probably were making their way up to Duluth and stopped in Hinckley. The fortune teller, I think they mentioned someone reading hands, but, I just thought that was interesting, so I kinda ran with it for the book. Anything else?
How have you found the time? With your kiddos and your life and
She
your
has
husband
three
and
busy kids.
everything else?
This is my hobby and it's fun, so I don't really do a lot of anything else.
Looks like your job.
Yeah, kinda. I have a lot of help from both sets of grandparents for watching the kids, and Dan helps out. Actually, we just came to another agreement. He's kicking me out of the house on Wednesday night so I can work on book 2. Yeah.
Where are you gonna go?
Well, for this book, we started that 2 years ago, and I ended up going to Pine Tech because they have a really nice like cafe area that I was writing in. But then I learned that it's not necessarily an open campus, so I'm going to my parents' house to write. But my kids went to that preschool, so I didn't feel like I was trespassing or anything. It was just always really quiet and no one bugged me when I started reading. I think I wrote all of part 1 actually there. Anything else?
You wake up in the middle of the night with thoughts that you gotta quick write down?
Yeah, I wouldn't say thoughts, but
Or
I'll like run
Or
through,
some-
yeah, I'll run through conversations or scenes in my head. And then if I try to write it down, or I'll have my phone, I have notes on there, so I can quick type it in, and I don't have to get up.
Right.
You have an amazing talent.
Thanks.
Yes.
You know, reading it, you feel like you were there.
Yes,
Thanks.
yes.
When I was writing it, and I first sent some chapters to my editor, Diane Engelstead, we went back and forth on what point of view to write it from, because most novels are not written in the first person, which mine is, and that part I fought, or I didn't fight, but I really thought that was important to write it, so the reader was Carl, and you had to experience the fire, the reader was Anna, so you had to sit in the well, instead of reading from like a storyteller telling their story. I wanted the reader to actually experience it. I just thought everyone would remember it more, click with it more. I
Very
guess.
powerful.
Thanks.
Yes.
Is there gonna be a movie?
I don't know anything about making movies. I'm hoping to get an audio book and then a large print version first. But I gotta learn about all that too. I didn't mention it before, but I self-published the book too. So all of those extras, I'd have to learn about and figure out how to do it, which I like doing. It just takes time. I've been asked about a large print version and an audiobook, which I would love to do. It would take time, and then it would take time away from writing book 2. So it'll come. It'll just come slowly, I guess.
Do you know how many you've sold so far?
I don't know how many this year. I know in 2024, I sold, I think 325, which was more than I expected. So this year it's probably a little bit less than that, but still going very well.
Good.
Yeah.
The Cambridge bookstore was all sold out and they have more on order.
Oh, really?
Mhm.
Wow. And like I was just telling Butch, I didn't even know it was there. So there's a website online that you can upload your file to, and they have their own printers, and then bookstores can order it through them, and then I get a commission from that. So it could be possible that it's being sold places that I don't even know about.
I ordered mine off Amazon.
Yep, that's where I first uploaded it, yeah. Because it's so easy, they have so many how-tos on how to, so when I self-published, I had to figure out formatting, how to put the maps in, stuff like that, how to change the font, which seems like it should be easy, but It's kind of like a test it out and see what it looks like, print one and see what it looks like, or even the margins. I mean, that's why people pay publishers, so they don't have to worry about that.
Kristina, thank you
Mm-hmm.
for coming and answering all of our questions and for an amazing presentation.
Yeah, thank you.